So I want to welcome everybody to the afternoon session for the monthly escrow review. This is going to be about an hour long today, and it's going to cover a couple pieces of information that I feel that most people will find beneficial. So Stephanie Lozano and I wanted to create a program where we could give information that would be pertinent to everybody on a recurring basis, and we decided to create these monthly training sessions to do so. So this program is set up for everybody to attend, whether you're a receptionist, an assistant, an escrow officer, even if you're a sales rep. You might be able to find some of this information beneficial. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're going to start with me just giving a brief explanation of how these classes are going to work. So first and foremost, like I said, these are going to happen once a month on the first Wednesday of every month. The email invites that I sent out to everybody should have put a series of these trainings on your calendar. And if they did not, let me know. I can always resend them to you. Just as they were today, you'll see the login information for the go-to meeting or the conference call. And it's, as you guys have already all successfully done, pretty easy to join. Generally, I'm going to try and stray away from strict lecture style of webinars, because one of my biggest complaints when I'm viewing a TLTA webinar for continuing education requirements is that they're incredibly boring. To hear the same person talk for an hour straight. So we're going to try and avoid that moving forward. And the way we're going to do that is I'm going to take some opportunities to bring some additional people in to help train us. So those would be CPAs, people who are certified with TLTA, attorneys, anybody that could give us beneficial information where we could benefit as a whole, as a company. We're going to try and do that. Now for today though, it's really just going to be me talking, just because this is our introductory session and I want to make sure this is a very basic version of it. And there's some basic information, but it is very important. So again, today is just going to be me. So what we wanted to do when we created this program is incentivize people to attend these, because I think everybody has been guilty of it at some point. When you have to get your CE requirements done for TLTA, it's really easy to put the webinar on and minimize it in the background and continue to work. That's not what we're trying to do with these sessions. We really want people to actively participate in these. And like we'll find out in a couple of minutes, if you have questions, if you have information that you feel would be beneficial for the group, I highly encourage you to put it in the chat. This is a judgment-free zone. There is no stupid questions. I just want you to know that, again, this is more of a group involvement thing. I want people to actually be involved with this and participate. So in order to do that, what we're doing is we're incentivizing, again, attendance. And this is how we're going to do it. For every class that you attend, you're going to get 1 credit. Now, if you attend both the morning and the afternoon sessions for 1 month, you're not going to get 2 credits. You only get 1. So if you really like the way I speak on these things and you want to attend multiple ones, feel free to do so. I highly encourage that if you don't feel like you had a good grasp of the information in the morning session, feel free to attend the afternoon. But generally, we've done 2 sessions to make it more accessible for everybody. So once you've attended 1, you're going to get 1 credit. And after 5 credits, you're going to get an extra half day of PTO. And that's something that's been approved by regional management. And Stephanie and Tom will back me up. So if you don't believe me, feel free to text them or email them. They'll tell you, yep, that's the deal. And generally, I understand that is probably going to be very enticing for most people. Now, the real issue moving forward is that just showing up for these classes moving forward from March onward is not going to get you a credit for the class. Starting in March, at the end of each one of these webinars, I'm going to be circulating a quick 5-question quiz to all the attendees that attend the session. And once you've completed that quiz with 100% efficacy and report it back to me, I'll get you credit for the class. Now, these quizzes are not going to be incredibly difficult. It's not going to be the sort of thing where you have to go open up the basic manual and figure out the answer to a question. If you've generally been paying attention to what's happening throughout the session, these questions will be pretty easy for you to answer. So again, that's going to be moving forward starting in March. For today, just simply attending the session, you're going to get credit for it. So again, you get credit for every class you attend. After 5, we're giving you guys an extra half day of PTO. I do like to put this disclosure out there that just because you have that extra half day of PTO does not mean you just get to take it whenever you want. You're still going to need to be able to check with your branch manager to make sure that it's okay that you take an extra half day here or there. I know around the holidays, we all kind of experienced being pretty strained from all the people taking time off at the same time. We don't want this extra half day of PTO to cause that all over again. So, once you've gotten credit for those 5 classes, we'll notify your branch manager, hey, so-and-so has that extra half day of PTO, and you'll just need to take that up with them in particular to make sure that the day that you want to take off is available to you to take off. So any questions on that, let me know in the chat. It's pretty self-explanatory and pretty straightforward, but I'm happy to answer any questions or if there's any confusion. So with that being said, we're going to move to our very first topic, which is audits. And this is one of the bigger questions that I personally get asked because I think there's a lot of confusion surrounding the audit process itself. I think not a lot of people have ever really been trained on what an audit actually is or why it's important or how it can help me. A lot of people hear the word audit and they automatically tense up thinking this is a negative thing. Well, that's what we're trying to change, both in settlement services and just regionally for San Antonio, Austin, and the Valley. We want people to start viewing audits not as a negative thing, but as an opportunity to learn and improve as escrow staff. I think that if any one of you were to sit here and say, I'm 100% perfect, I never mess anything up, you'd be lying to yourself. Because even if you're not aware that you messed it up, I guarantee you small mistakes are easy to make. And if they're fixable, corporate or settlement services, we're not going to approach you about it. We're just going to fix it because if they're easy mistakes, we're just going to fix them for you. But generally, I'm going to digress and go over some of the more common questions that I get or corporate receives regarding audits themselves. And the first one is, how are files audited? Now, generally, files are audited using what we call a short audit sheet. And this is a copy of the short audit sheet. Now, you can find a copy of this document in RamQuest documents. I believe it's named short audit sheet or CTOT short audit sheet. So if you ever wanted to see it, this is exactly what the audit sheet looks like. You might have received some of these from corporate, and we'll go into that in just a moment. But I wanted you guys to all at least have the ability to sit down and see exactly what this looks like. So as you can tell, the audit sheet itself is pretty detailed. And we audit files pretty regularly over here in settlement services. And I'll tell you, one of these audits take about 15 minutes to get done. And that's if we're really trying to get it done. Because you're going to have to go through every single one of these items and make sure it's there. And this is not something you're going to really have to concern yourselves with. You don't have to audit yourselves. There are people up at corporate who do it. Lisa Kelly's a really common one. Settlement service does it. We really only do it to be able to give you information of how your unit is performing. And I think that until a lot of people see just how detailed an audit is, I think a lot of people would be surprised as to how many items in the file are necessary to be present in FileScan. And so I wanted to try and lift some of that uncertainty by just showing you what this is. Now, if you wanted to copy this and you just can't find it in RamQuest, feel free to send me an email. I'll send you a copy. There are some people that once they have seen the audit sheet, they revise their front of file sheet or their checklists. I'm happy to help with that as well. So whatever it is that's going to make it easier for you guys, you just let me know. Generally, files are audited at random up in corporate, or if there is a claim on the property. So if somebody comes back and says, hey, I have an unpaid tax bill, what's going on? Generally, the first thing corporate is going to do is audit the file to make sure that there are no additional mistakes. In settlement services, we randomly audit files. So generally, we have a method as to, we take a report of 2 weeks worth of files, region-wide for both San Antonio and Austin, and we audit a random 20% of them. So it's not that we're targeting one person or we think that one closing unit is worse than another. We truly are randomly auditing these files just to be able to give you guys information. And escrow officers, I think a lot of you have already experienced that when you sat down with Stephanie and Tom for your goal setting meetings. This is probably one of the things they went over with you. Just, hey, here's where you're doing really well. Here's some things where you probably need some work on. Those are coming straight from audits. So that being said, the next item that the common question that's commonly asked is, what do I do if I receive an audit from corporate? And again, I think this has a lot to do with the fact that a lot of people see the word audit and essentially just tense up. But if you receive an audit from corporate, nobody's going to get written up. Nobody's going to get fired. They just want you to be able to fix the items that are missing on the short audit sheet themselves. So if you get an email from Lisa Kelly or Don Neal or Kay Siebold or Melinda Demery, anybody up at corporate who's auditing your files, and they send you an email and say, see attached audit, please correct items needed. just go ahead and do it. It's not a matter of life or death that it gets done immediately. It certainly doesn't take precedent over funding and closing files at the end of the month, but they are expecting a realistic response time. So don't put this on your back burner and forget about it for a month. It just makes more sense to fix it right then and there. Many of the items that they're going to ask you to fix can be fixed in less than 5 minutes. So if it's a matter of you don't have a final copy of your commitment in file scan, well, we all know that takes about 2 minutes to put in a file scan if you're really not trying to rush through it. I mean, that process is pretty easy. So again, if you get something from corporate, just make sure to respond to them with what they need. I think the vast majority of us are doing a great job with that. But I do get some emails sometimes where they say, hey, this branch isn't responding to these audits, or this closer's not responding. So again, just do your best to respond in an adequate amount of time. Last question I'd like to go over is something that's asked all the time. How can my team be more prepared for audits? Well, generally, the easiest answer to this question is file scan correctly. And when we're talking about file scanning, the easiest way to do so is, number one, follow the checklist that was handed out after the most recent escrow officer meetings. If you need another copy of that checklist, let me know. I can send it to you. It's not a problem at all. But generally, when you're scanning your files after closing or even during the processing of the file, there's a general rule of thumb that's worked well for me that might work well for you too. I always ask myself, if I'm placing this item in file scan and naming it, would I be able to go back into this file in 6 months and immediately identify and locate what I'm looking for? And if the answer is no, then it needs to be named better, right? So if there's an important email, maybe an underwriter approval for something to be removed from Schedule C, maybe scan that in separately because that's going to get your policy out much faster. And if people are auditing your file, they're generally using the same rule of thumb that TDI is going to use when they audit your file. If they're not really able to readily identify the information in the first 5 minutes, they're going to assume it's not there. So the way that we counteract that and make sure that we don't fall into that situation is by, again, labeling things correctly in the file scan. Other than that, if you just make sure you're not missing simple steps, which we'll talk about on the next slide, some of the most commonly missed items on audits, you really can't be more prepared than just making sure you're doing a good job processing the file, making sure you're doing a good job leaving a paper trail, and leaving a clear picture of what happened with this file for people coming in after your file is closed. Because I think a lot of people miss out on the fact that it might seem like only the assistants and escrow officers touch these files. It's just not true. I mean, the policy department touches these files. Bring the dates touch these files. The exam and abstract departments touch them. So there's a lot of people other than our escrow staff who are in these files looking for information. So if we as escrow staff are able to make it more readily identifiable and available, it will help you drastically on audits. So next thing I'm going to talk about in regards to audits is the top 3 categories that we're seeing missed. And this isn't really specific to any particular unit. And this is not to say that every single one of you on this call has these problems. But overall, across San Antonio and Austin at least, these are the issues that we're seeing commonly come up on audits. The first one has to do with commitments themselves. Now, there's generally 2 items that we're having trouble with commitments. Number one is the privacy policy letter and the jacket not being present. So a lot of people, I wouldn't say a lot of people, but some people, when they're sending out title commitments, only will send out the guts of the commitment. They send Schedule A, B, C, and D. They send it to the buyer and the seller. They send it to the lender. And everything's good, right? Well, no, it's not. You need to make sure that that privacy policy letter and the jacket are present. And I'm going to show you exactly what I mean by that. In RamQuest, there are 2 ways that you can get to the guts of your commitment. Number one is to go into file scan and pull the original exam. Now that works for our marked up copy, our working copy of our commitment, because for our purposes, we don't really need to see the jacket. We don't need to see the privacy policy or the wire notification. We just need to know what's on Schedule A, B, C, and D. But everybody else, and according to TDI and some procedural rules, we need to make sure that we include this information when we circulate a commitment to outside parties. So I'm just going to briefly go over how to do that for those of you who aren't aware. In your document screen in RamQuest, what you're going to do is search for the commitment based on the underwriter that's been selected for the file. Now, if you wanted to check the underwriter selected for the file, you could go into the main tab of order entry, and it will tell you exactly who the underwriter is. Now, many people probably just assume that First National is the underwriter on a lot of these deals. I'm going to tell you that's definitely not the case. I have seen files where we open them, put them on First National, and then the abstract and exam departments change the underwriter to Stewart or Fidelity. and don't notify us. And the only way that we can actually find that out is if we check the underwriter there. So the first thing I'm going to do if I'm pulling a commitment is I'm double checking to make sure I'm selecting the right underwriter, because the jacket to the commitment is specific to the underwriter. So once I've identified that it's First National, I'm going back into the document screen and I'm going to search for the underwriter. And you're going to see that there's a couple different options. So any option generally in this document screen that's in teal means it's a package. So when I go to print this, it's going to pull up multiple documents at a time. And I'm just going to go ahead and pull this First National package just to show you what it looks like and what is needing to be included when we talked about jacket and privacy policy. So we're pulling a couple pieces of information here. Now, this first page right here, this is the jacket that they're talking about. They need to have this information here. This is actually pursuant to one of the procedural rules, P68, for those of you who are procedural rule nerds. This actually satisfies P68, but it needs to be there. This is part of your jacket. And you're going to notice this looks completely different than it does if you were to pull in an original exam. So when we talk about missing a privacy policy letter or a jacket not present, that's just a matter of you guys didn't save a commitment into file scan with the privacy policy and the jacket present. So when we're in RamQuest and we pull this screen here, you would want to save this all as one big attachment into file scan. That's the easiest way to make sure that you don't get marked down for not doing that on an audit. The next most common issue on commitments is the marked up copy not being present in file scan. Now, this is a generally recent change because at Capital Title, we weren't always required to have the marked up copy present, or at least it wasn't specifically annotated, but it was always a good practice. So when we say marked up copy not present, what we mean is your working copy of the commitment has not been individually scanned into file scan. And so working copy meaning when you guys typically get a commitment, your front end assistant or the escrow officer will print out the original exam, schedules A through D. You brat it down to the left-hand or the right-hand side of your folder, whichever your unit does, and you start to write on there, specifically more on Schedule C, of what needs to be done to cure all these items. That's what we're talking about when we talk about worked up copy. Once you guys get done with your file, be sure to scan a copy of that into file scan. That helps your policy get issued much faster. It helps anybody that's auditing your file know exactly what happened. I get emails all the time from the policy department where they say, hey, on this file, I'm not finding anything that addresses Schedule C Item 7. And then we all have to go look in the file and figure out what's going on, and it takes forever. And then we have to reach out to you. It's been 6 months since the file is closed, and it's just a giant waste of time when all we could have done is put in this marked up copy and avoided that issue altogether. So many of you already have these by default and have just been kind of scanning them with random correspondence. So moving forward, make sure to scan this copy separately if you're not doing so already. Next item that we're commonly seeing be an issue on audits are recording fees. Now, this one is definitely going to get an eye roll from some people in the audience, but I understand how frustrating it is for recording fees. As an escrow officer, it is definitely one of the last things on my mind. And it might seem like it's just easier to over-collect and refund 6 months later, but some of the lenders are starting to send requests where there's like 20 files at once, and fixing that takes a very long time. So generally, the way that I try and avoid this is if I'm working up a CD, whether I be an assistant or an escrow officer, when I send my first iteration of the closing disclosure or the HUD to the lender, I ask them to verify the page counts on the recordables. Now, a lot of lenders have already gotten used to giving you that information up front, whether that be in an email or by attaching the deed of trust and or warranty deed with their closing instructions. But there are still many lenders who are not doing this. And I'll tell you right now, lenders are not checking recording fees for accuracy when they're reviewing your CD. They're just assuming that the information that you give them is correct on 9 out of 10 deals. So make sure that you're taking that extra step, that just that extra sentence you have to type in an email, just say, can you confirm the page count of the deed of trust? And can you confirm the page count of the warranty deed in the instances where the lender is preparing that document? So next item here is a very big one. It's our bring to date or tax cert update missing altogether. Now, this might not seem like a giant deal to everybody, but I'm going to tell you I think this is more of an error with the light bulb than it is with anything else. So we're all on the same page. Your bring to date does not get run automatically anymore. Your tax cert update will not get run automatically anymore. And what I mean by that is in RamQuest, in the light bulb, and I'm going to go into a file here. when we go to run our bring to date task and we've opened a file, you're generally already going to see a due date generated here. And that's because when we open our file and it's completed all of the items up here, the system will automatically generate a due date in most instances for the bring to date. But the issue is, in order to get a task run in the light bulb itself, whether that be bring to date, authority docs, any task where you're outsourcing that to a new department, there are two things that you need to do to ensure that your task is run correctly. Number one, like we talked about, is to make sure there's a due date for the task. But number two, you need to make sure that the assigned department is correct. You're going to notice here from the bring to date, for example, that yes, I can have a due date here, but the assigned department says escrow, and escrow doesn't run bring to dates. Bring to date runs bring to dates. So the real reason they did this is because when we launched the light bulb and we launched the dashboard to everybody at Capital Title, we used to have this assigned department automatically selected for bring to dates and tax certs. But this due date is being generated based on the closing date that you're putting into order entry. So if you put a closing date of February 25th into order entry and your file doesn't end up closing until March 25th, well, this system doesn't automatically update. So bring to date was getting notifications to do bring to dates on files that were nowhere near closed or were canceled altogether. So it was creating a bottleneck in work for them. So to kind of circumvent that issue, they've taken this away completely to where when you have to run a bring to date, you're going to now need to be able to select the correct department. Now, it's a pretty commonsensical naming. Bring to date department is literally called bring to date. If it's an out of county file, you'll need to make sure you select the out of county. And if you absolutely needed it rushed, you could select that option. But I will warn you, if you are consistently selecting the rush option, they are much less likely to rush your files because they are very good at noticing that pattern. But there are legitimate reasons you want to rush a bring to date. Now, the same thing is true with the tax certificate. You can update your tax certificate in the light bulb in the same way, make sure there's a due date here in an assigned department. But truthfully, you should be able to update your tax certificate in closing market. And I'm going to show you how to do that. For those of you who have APG as your tax cert provider, you can go into closing market here and look for the option that says American Property Guard and hit submit over here on the right. All you'll need to do is check exactly what you need them to give you. And in this instance, it's the tax certificate. So I would check tax cert and hit submit, and that's it. I've been finding that if you request a tax certificate update through closing market, it gets you your tax cert back a little faster, a couple hours faster. And sometimes those couple hours can make a big difference. But we want to make sure that we're at least getting an updated tax certificate. There's an excellent question in the morning session about tax certificate updates. Even if your taxes are paid, even if it's not payable season, you still need to have a tax certificate update done prior to closing. It needs to be done within 10 days of closing, just like a bring to date. And the reason why is sometimes the tax office will randomly put a tax suit on there, and maybe it's not a reason for unpaid taxes. It could be unpaid court costs. It could be abstract fees. It could be anything that they just all of a sudden decided to put on the tax certificate. I've seen 2 of them in the last week where that's happened. They also might be removing exemptions and increasing the overall base tax amount, which affects your prorations. So it's important that we get that done prior to closing. So we'll go into a little more of why the bring to date and tax cert update are important and why TDI thinks it's incredibly important near the end of the presentation. But for now, that's basically all I wanted to talk to you about in regards to audits. So if you have any questions about anything in the audits that we've talked about so far, go ahead and type them into chat. I know I have a couple questions already, so I'm going to go ahead and address these now. Let's see here. So first question, any possibility for RamQuest to figure out recording fees based on the number of pages we tell it? Generally, I suggest that you calculate this yourself. And the reason why is RamQuest, I don't think, has recent recording fees for every county. But I will tell you that the easiest way to put recording fees into the closing disclosure is through the recording itemization screen. And I'm going to show you that screen real quick. So in our closing disclosure form here, we're looking for this item here that looks like REC, that means recording. It's going to pop up a screen that looks much like this. I know that a lot of you, when you're working up closing disclosures, like to put your recording fees in manually in section E by just creating a new line. But if you go through the recording itemization screen and do it this way, it will populate to your T64 correctly instead of you having to fill that information out individually. So I suggest you put them through here. They don't give you a page count generally, so it's just going to be the sort of thing where you're going to have to manually enter this information. If you were ever unsure about the recording fees for a particular county, let me know. I have a list of every single county's recording fees that is updated constantly by our e-recording desk. I'm happy to share that with you guys. All right, let's see. Next question here. Can the commitment bring to date be done a couple days before closing, or does it have to be done the day before? That's an excellent question. The bring to date itself, according to our audit regulations, has to be obtained within 10 days of your closing date. I personally think that generally, if you run a bring to date at the time you get your closing instructions, or maybe a day before, that's usually the safest thing to do. Your bring to date is there to protect you from things that have been recently filed with the county courthouse. So sometimes I have seen instances where closers will run bring to dates the day of closing or after closing. That doesn't do you any good, because it does happen, albeit rare, but it does happen where in between the original certification date on our commitment and your closing date, something gets filed a public record that affects your file. I've seen it happen. It is much more common than you think. And yes, 95% of the time it won't happen, but that 5% of the time it does, you're going to really regret not getting a bring to date done. Because the first question that corporate is going to ask when you ask to take a loss for something like this is, did you run a bring to date, and was it found on the bring to date? And if you say no, then the outlook isn't probably going to look that great for you. So I always recommend generally that I run my bring to date at least a couple days before closing. Now I understand there are certain times and instances where you don't get closing instructions until the day of. So maybe it's just a change in process to where, you need to remind yourself, hey, 2 days, 3 days before closing, I need to run a bring to date. Generally, bring to dates will be done same day. End of the month, that department gets a little bottlenecked. But if you give it a couple days, you'll have it back in plenty of time to review. And if you find something on a bring to date, if there's a brand new abstract of judgment on the seller side, stop the closing. Don't go through with the closing and just pretend it's not going to be an issue. It might not pop up and be an issue before you fund the file, but 6 months down the line, it will be. And at this point, it's accumulated penalties and interest, which means it's going to be more expensive now. And while we have our sellers at the table and they have to perform, it's easier for us to get the information we need from them to be able to collect the amounts necessary to cure that item. Next question, do final title commitments need to be signed? The answer is yes. All title commitments that you are circulating need to have an escrow officer signature. Now, if you are a licensed escrow officer, you should have your signature preloaded into RamQuest so that if you individually are pulling title commitments, your signature should automatically be populating both on the jacket and on Schedule C. But if it's not, let me know. I can get with you and I can work with RamQuest support to get your signature uploaded. Now, the next question I generally get from people when I tell people this is, well, can I upload my signature on my assistant's iteration of RamQuest? And unfortunately, the answer to that question is no, because your signature is tied to your license. And since your license is tied to you individually, your assistant won't be able to pull your signature and pre-populate it on commitments and policies or anything else that you're sending out where the escrow officer is responsible for countersigning the title insurance form. Let's see. Are the BTD commitments required to be signed? Escrow assistant signatures not automatically populated. Therefore, additional signatures, scanning and posting. So your bring to date commitment, it's kind of an indirect answer to that question. So when you have your bring to date done, you should be pulling a final copy of your title commitment. So it's not necessarily that it's a bring to date commitment more than it is your final commitment. And that is another one of the items on the short audit sheet is, did the branch pull a final commitment? So when I get the bring to date back, the first thing I'm doing is looking at it, because that is one of the most helpful items to protect me as a closer and as an assistant to make sure that nothing's wrong. And once I've reviewed that and I've addressed anything that is potentially requiring attention, I will just go ahead and pull another copy of the commitment and save it in the file scan. And it will need a signature on it. So I know a lot of escrow officers don't typically pull their own commitments. So, assistants, you're either going to need to print out the commitment and have it signed by your escrow officer, or just ask your escrow officer to sign, to pull a copy of the commitment and save it in the file scan. All right, let's see. Got a couple more questions here. Next question, when I entered a notice to purchaser in the recording screen, it did not create a line item. Is there a way to break it out on the CD? There is, Becky, and I will show you. So in the recording itemization screen, let's take a look. So generally, I will tell you two things. If you put the notice to purchaser, these MUD notice recording fees in the recording itemization screen, while it might not break out the additional line item, that's what your T64 is for. So if you put it in this screen, it will populate on your T64, which protects you on disclosures purposes, but it should update the monetary amount on the closing disclosure itself. And if you're finding that if you're putting additional line items here that's not the deed or the deed of trust, and you're not seeing the actual monetary amount update on the CD, email me individually with your GF number and the subject line. I'll take a look at it. But the real issue is when we're adding additional recording fees, we want to make sure that this is disclosed to the borrower. So even if it's not creating an additional line on your closing disclosure, it is creating an additional piece of information on your T64, provided you're putting this information into the recording itemization screen, which is all you need to be able to comply with the TRID requirements for disclosure. Next question, is there a problem with multiple bring to dates? No, you can run as many bring to dates as you want. And if you run a bring to date and your file ends up getting pushed back 2 weeks, you should run another bring to date closer to closing. There is no such thing as CYAing too much. So run as many bring to dates as you like. Now, you don't need to run one a day every day leading up to closing. You really just need to make sure that at the bare minimum, one has been completed within 10 days of closing. Okay, so that looks like most of the questions for now. And if you have more questions, that's not a problem. Just let me know. I can always answer them as we move on, but I'm going to move to the next section here. And that is going to be order entry. So order entry is one of our bigger issues as a company, whether that be information missing or 1099s not in order entry. So one of the things I'd like to do on this session is just kind of give you a general overview of the best way to enter orders and the best way to update information in order entry. Because order entry itself is just the name of the screen in RamQuest. It does not end after you've entered the order. Order entry is one of the most important screens in RamQuest because it really is where every other part of RamQuest is pulling information from. It's where your closing disclosure pulls information from, your commitment pulls information from. Any document that you're pulling that's pre-populating information, that's coming straight from order entry. So as far as actually using the program RamQuest, this is one of the most important steps in the process. And I know a lot of the times receptionists and assistants are putting this information in, but even escrow officers can benefit from this information. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to generally put in an order. Now, I'm not going to go through every single line item and type in everything, but I do have some information that I think most people will find helpful when it comes to entering an order. So first and foremost, when you get a new contract in to enter or a builder contract, you need to make sure that the address on the contract is supposed to be at your specific office. So if you get a contract that has an address for another capital title office, call the agent and verify that information. We want to make sure that we're not creating any confusion with our branches or with our clients or with the consumers, so it never hurts to make that extra phone call. Also, make sure that that sales contract is fully executed. There needs to be an executed date. There needs to be initials at the bottom of every page on the sales contract. Anything that needs to be signed before you open your GF number. If it's not executed, notify the agents immediately and have them fix it. Because we're finding a lot of the times, if we don't, we're getting these audits from lenders that are saying, hey, the sales contract was never fully executed. You need to go fix that. And 6 months down the line, it's probably pretty impossible to get a hold of the seller who's already been paid and really doesn't care to comply with our request. So again, if you get a contract and something seems wrong or it's missing information, like it's missing addendums, the HOA addendum, almost always missing on sales contracts with particular agents. If the information on the address for the capital title office that needs to be added is incorrect, or you're missing signatures and initials, just ask the agent. Put it on them, because it is really their job to make sure their clients are signing the contract. So after I have a full contract that's fully executed and everything looks good, the next thing we're going to do before we open an order is we're going to go to the County Appraisal District's website, and we're going to pull the CAD that matches what's on the contract. So generally, you can search by the property address, you can search by the owner's name, whatever's going to be easier for you individually. but pull the CAD. You're going to find, and I'm sure you already have, that on many sales contracts, the legal description is absolutely incorrect. They're missing the block, they're missing the lot, there's no NCB, the county's completely wrong. So it is an extra step that we're taking to make sure that, number one, are they actually conveying the correct property? And number two, is my title plant running abstract and exam on the correct property? Because I see it happen all the time where we run the wrong property altogether because the sales contract is incorrect. So if I'm going to enter an order, I want to make sure that the legal on the contract matches the actual legal description of the property according to the county appraisal district site. After we have that information, definitely print out your CAD. You're going to want to put a copy of that CAD into file scan with your sales contract. That helps the title plant and the tax desk get that information back to you that much faster. And it requires them to do a lot less thinking in regards to, am I searching the right property? So anything we can do to make it easier for the plant to get commitments to us, we really should be doing. They already, are on a 5-day turnaround. And if they have to sit there and ask a bunch of questions and find out a bunch of information in regards to the legal description, you're just adding days onto the processing time. So once we have this information, the last thing we need to do before we actually open an order is see if there's been a previous GF number first entered in RamQuest. So the easiest way to do that generally is to use this little address search function. It is a blue globe, and generally you can just type the property address here. If you see that there's an order already opened with this property address, write down the GF number, and you're going to put that in the notes section of the order entry task in the light bulb. This helps the title plant skip a lot of the steps in abstract that they don't need to do, provided that the prior file is pretty recent. So if you see something, just be sure to give them that information. That way they don't have to run an entire run sheet all over again. They can start off where they left off with the last file. So once we have all that information, that seems like a lot of information. It's because it is, and I think that's a lot of steps that most people aren't taking. And again, most of the time in title insurance, 99% of the time, you're never going to see this really be an issue. But that 1% of the time that something goes haywire and it really messes things up, you're going to really wish you took the extra 2 minutes just to print the CAD properly. So once we have that information, we're going to go ahead and open our new file. It's pretty simple. We're going to File and then New File. Now, as far as best practices are concerned, once you get to the new screen that says Enter New File, the very first thing that you need to do is take this GF number and write it in the top right-hand portion of your sales contract. It is very easy to get derailed completely from entering an order. You might get a phone call. Somebody might walk up to your desk and ask you for information where you have to switch into a different file. And it happens to where you can't get back to that original GF number and you just would have wasted all that time entering that order. So again, when you get your new GF number, write it on the top right-hand portion of your sales contract. The next thing we need to do is we need to select the type of order that it is. It's pretty simple. 1 is for a residential purchase and 2 is for a residential refinance. They are all named pretty accordingly. So just kind of select the option that best applies. But just know that you're going to have to select a type of order here in order to make sure that your commitment is getting run in an appropriate amount of time. So for this instance, we're just going to kind of assume that this is a residential purchase rather. Once I've selected that option, I don't need to select anything down here. I can just hit OK. Now, I'm just going to briefly go over all the information in the main tab. This is one of the more important tabs outside of the property tab itself, but a lot of people really don't know what all these fields are for up here, so I'm going to kind of review them with you. Number 1 is status. This is not something you're ever going to have to change. This will automatically default to the correct option. Number 2 is the escrow bank. This should automatically select to the correct bank account based on what branch you're in. Unless you're Paisanos recently. So if you're at Paisanos and you're on this call, yes, I know that's been kind of confusing lately, but you should not have to worry about that moving forward. It should automatically select for you. Number 3 is the closing agent field. This is the escrow officer for the deal. You need to make sure that you select something in this box here. Number 4 is the underwriter. Now, this is something that will automatically default to First National Title, but if this is an instance where you know you're going to have to write it on Stewart or Fidelity, then this is the opportunity that you would take to change this. Now, most people that are entering orders don't know that information, but escrow officers and escrow assistants, if you know that that needs to be swapped up front, just be forthcoming with that information to the person that's entering your orders. Next thing is the settlement agent ID. This is the ID that identifies your branch. Number 6 is our referral. This is where we're going to put who sent us the deal. the actual agent that sent us the deal. So when you're entering information into the referral field, this needs to be an individual person, not the brokerage. So if I wanted to say, for instance, that Jason Brooks sent this deal to me, I would search Jason Brooks, not Jason Brooks with Keller Williams Heritage, but Jason Brooks. It's important that we're making sure we're selecting an individual person here. All the reports that our sales team and marketing team run, as well as commission reports for end of the month, we use this referral information to keep track of who's sending us orders and how often they're sending them to us. So if you don't put information here or you're not using the individual name, that can cause orders to be credited incorrectly, which kind of muddy our reports. And our reports generally all rely on information put into order entry. Yet another reason why this is a very important screen. Next option here is order category that we'll go into. This is just like the type of order you selected when you opened the order. It's pretty simple. Just select the one that best applies here. Critical dates, there are a ton of dates here, but truthfully, you really just need to put the closing date based on what's in the sales contract. If you don't have the closing date, you can leave this blank. The commitment due date is not going to change how fast you get your commitment back. If you put tomorrow, it's not going to get your commitment back tomorrow. Just go ahead and leave it blank. Next option up here is service. And this is something that I'm going to go into in detail a little bit because I don't think very many people outside of escrow officers and some assistants really are able to distinguish between what type of service we should be issuing. So this service field is specific to the type of policy that we're going to be issuing with the transaction. So owner would mean owner's policy only. So this is for cash deals. Mortgage means mortgagee, or this is for refinances most commonly. Simult means simultaneously issuing. That means you're issuing both an owner's policy and a loan policy at the same time. Binders for construction deals, but is very rarely used. And we never use the other field usually. Very few instances where we would, but generally you're always going to be selecting owner, simultaneous, or mortgagees. Now you're going to notice that there are two different options for the owner and simultaneous selection. One says res and one says non-res. Well, this is distinguishing between a residential and a non-residential policy. Now there's a really easy way to tell which type of policy you should be issuing. And this is important information, so I highly encourage you to write this down. In order for you to issue a residential policy, you must pass a two-pronged test in issuing this policy. Number one is asking the question, is the buyer a natural person? Do they walk on 2 feet? If the answer is yes, then you move to the next question, which is the property residential real property? Meaning there has to be a residence on it that is able to be occupied as a residential premises. If both of the answers to those questions are not yes, then you must issue a non-residential policy. So I'm going to repeat that. Unless your buyer is an individual person or married couple, not an entity, not an LLC, not a trust, not any of that, unless they are a natural person and there is a home on the property that you can occupy as your primary residence, you must issue a non-residential policy. So most of the common issues with this are vacant land. Vacant land does not pass the two-pronged test because there's not a residence on the property. So for vacant land, you issue a non-residential policy. Well, what about a 1 to 4 family contract where the buyer is an LLC? Well, they're not a natural person. They're an LLC. That's an entity. So you have to issue a non-residential policy. Some of the most common losses we see across the region are because people are incorrectly selecting residential or non-residential policies and endorsements. And it can be important. The policy premium itself doesn't necessarily change, but the endorsements absolutely change as far as the amount of money we have to collect for residential versus non-residential policies. The most common issue is with the survey amendment. The survey amendment for residential policies, I believe, is collected at the 5% rate, if I remember correctly. For non-residential, it's collected at 10% of the premium. So you could see that if we issued the wrong type of premium, we could be short a couple $100. And then we have to make an unpleasant phone call back to the seller, whoever paid for the policy, and say, hey, you owe us $200. Sorry, my bad. That's not always a fun conversation to have. So I wanted to give everybody the ability to see exactly how we select that type of service. And I think this information is relevant to more than just escrow officers. I think everybody needs to at least know how to distinguish between these because truthfully, we're a title insurance company. That's what we do. We sell insurance. And we need to be able to at least identify basic differences in policies. If you're interested in learning more about the difference between residential and non-residential policies, Procedural Rule 38 specifically annotates exactly how to tell. But generally, think of that two-pronged test. Are you a natural person? And is this a residence? If the answer is yes to both of those, it's a residential policy. Otherwise, it's non-res. All right, next. we're going to talk about the drop downs that need to be completed here. Escrow officer, pretty common sense. Just make sure you're selecting the correct escrow officer. Always hit yes to this pop-up here. This is just populating the light bulb correctly. Escrow processor is your assistant. I'm going to pretend Peggy Alb is my assistant. The title officer and title processor are not something you're ever going to have to fill out. That is the abstractor and the examiner, and they will fill that out for you in the title plan. Sales rep, one of the more important fields in order entry. Our sales reps do not get credit for deals according to our reports unless their name is selected under the sales rep field. So if you're an escrow officer and you're giving a contract to your receptionist to enter, you need to make sure that you, number one, tell them who the referral is so they can enter that information correctly, because you can't always assume it's the listing agent. It's not always the listing agent. Sometimes it's the buyer's agent, and sometimes it's even the lender. And number two, who's the sales rep? So we need to make sure that information's there. Last thing in the main tab, we're just putting in our sales price. After we've entered all this information, which is a lot of information, we can move on to the buyer-seller screen, which many of you already have familiarity with. And the only thing I like to point out in this screen is make sure that when you're selecting the agent, that you are selecting the brokerage and not the individual. So this is the inverse from the referral field. In referral field, we want to make sure that the individual is selected. So in our example, we use Jason Brooks. We'd want to search for Jason Brooks. But in the buyer and seller screen, we need to be sure that we're searching by the brokerage. So say it was a Keller Williams agent, I could search for Keller Williams and select the appropriate agent over here. Now, if you get into the buyer-seller screen and you start to search for the agent and it is not there, you can always create a new agent by clicking the new agent button down here. It will pop up a new screen. And this is where you really will fill out the information. So for brokerage, this would be where you would put Keller Williams. You'd put the address in the address field, city, state, zip. The agent's information goes in the contact first name and contact last name field. Additionally, you can add the broker license and the individual real estate agent's license into the license ID blanks. And if you do this on your agents, it will pre-fill page 5 of your CD for you as far as the agent's information is concerned automatically. So you'll stop getting that question from lenders. You'll stop having to go look at your sales contract and make sure that's correct. So once you've identified your agent, it'll pre-fill the selling agent for you. It's all good. We can move on from that point. The buyer screen is pretty simple, but I do tell people, if you have the information on the sales contract, put it in the screen. So on page 7 or 8 of your sales contract, depending on which type of form your agent uses, if they give you a full address, put it in the address field. If they give you a phone number, put it there too. If they give you an email address, absolutely put that there too. The seller screen is basically identical to the buyer screen, with the exception that there is a tax ID and social security number field. And this is where we're going to talk about 1099s for a little bit. So a lot of the times when you're opening a file, one of the first things that most people send to the seller is a seller information form, because we need to be able to have their social security number information and their loan number information most of the time just to order a payoff. But if you get your seller information form back 4 weeks before closing, just go ahead and go into the seller screen and enter their social security number over here ahead of time. Don't wait to funding to do this. I know that a lot of front-end assistants generally don't do this. They think that this is a funding issue. It is not. If you have this information on your desk in front of you, just take the extra 5 seconds and put it in the screen. As far as 1099 reports are concerned themselves, which we'll talk about in a second, we've all been doing very well with them. They have gotten much, much better, and everybody's gotten much more prudent about making sure this information is there. But we still are getting a 2 or 3 page report for every branch every month. And a lot of this information can be avoided just by, if you have the information in front of you, just enter it into order entry. And that goes along to what I spoke about earlier. Just because your order is already entered does not mean order entry is complete, because you're obtaining information over the course of the transaction that needs to be transcribed into the screen in order for RamQuest to really, truly shine as an operating software. So again, buyer-seller screen, pretty straightforward. Loan amount, the loan tab rather, pretty straightforward again. The sales price should pre-populate based on what you put in the main tab. The loan amount goes here. The earnest money deposit, please don't put anything in the screen until you actually have the actual earnest money funds in your hand. Because if I put something in the screen and I press tab, even if I try and press no one or not listed here, it will automatically create an anticipated deposit in check writing, which means if I don't go into check writing and book the earnest money, I'm probably going to get an email from accounting saying, hey, where's that $500 check that you said we should be expecting in this GF number? and you're not going to have it. It's a fixable issue, but generally, I always tell people, don't put it in until you have the earnest money in your hand. Lender information goes here as well. I do like to point out that when you put in lender information, you don't need to put the MIC number or the interest rate or the P&I or the mortgage insurance, any of this stuff. It really doesn't need to be there. Your lender is using their form as your final CD. The only things that you really absolutely need to have here are the lender themselves and the loan number. And that way your CPLs generate properly. Last thing here we're talking about in order entry is the property tab. Now this is where you're going to put the legal description of the property as well as the address for the property itself. I will tell you that you can try and put the lot and block up here, and you can try and search for the subdivision here. Sometimes that's really difficult to do. Sometimes the subdivision isn't there. So what I generally recommend is when I'm going to the County Appraisal District's website and I'm pulling that CAD, I'm copy pasting the legal description off the CAD, and you can paste it right into this field here. That'll save you a lot of time, and it will also ensure that you are identifying the exact correct legal based on what the appraisal district says it is. The only thing that you're going to need to select if you use this method of copy pasting a legal description, you will still need to select the county that's applicable here. This is important because if you don't select a county up here, many items in closing market won't work. It won't allow you to record documents without a county. It won't allow you to pull FedEx labels without a county selected. There are a couple things in here that you just won't be able to do. So if you're in closing market and you can't go through EPN document recording, or it's not letting you pull a FedEx label, it's probably because the county is not selected in the property screen. So just make sure you select something in this blank. After we've copy pasted our legal description, we would just need to select the type of property here. There's only 3 options, and generally they're pretty common sense. 1 to 4 family is for 1 to 4 family residences, vacant for vacant, commercial for commercial. So just select the one that best applies. After we've entered this information, we can enter the address into the address field here. It's not really a zip code, but that's okay. And that's really where our address information goes. The last step we'll take in the property tab is when you're on your CAD and you're on their website and you have the form in front of you, put the property ID in the tax ID field. This allows your tax desk to get your tax cert back much, much faster. And it also allows it to be a little more accurate because we have run into some issues where the tax desk, maybe there's multiple lots on the deal. They pull the wrong taxes altogether or miss lots altogether. So just make sure that if you have a property here, you're putting the property ID here. It will save you. That's pretty much it for property. The last thing we'll do is go into miscellaneous and verify that there has been a type of order selected. Now, if you've opened your order correctly at the very beginning, when they gave us that first pop-up window giving us our new GF number, it asked you what type of order it was, and we selected it there. But if you accidentally forget to select it, you can come into the miscellaneous tab and select the option straight from here. After we've entered our order, there's one last thing that we need to do. We need to go into the light bulb, and we need to complete the order entry task. If we don't go complete this task, none of our title search gets run, we don't get our commitment back, and it just sits there until 1 of 2 things happen. Either corporate emails you asking you, why didn't you complete this? Or number 2, it gets missed completely, and then 2 weeks later, you realize you don't have a commitment yet, at which point you're still 5 days out from a commitment. So make sure that you don't miss this step moving forward. It's really simple to complete it. You would just click on the completed date field and hit F6 on your keyboard. And when I do that, you can see that all the other tasks that are important and next in line have automatically generated a due date. That includes your tax certificate, title triage, which is what we at Capital call abstract. So again, that's important that we generate that. I'm going to delete all these before I get a nastygram from corporate. And once I've done that, your order has been entered. I know that seems like beneath a lot of people, and you might know how to do that, but you never know. You might have picked up a little tips or tricks here and there. I truthfully am told by escrow officers that they have no idea how to enter an order. So I hope you found that beneficial. But it is one of the bigger issues that we're finding in audits is that just because the order isn't entered correctly, wrong titles getting run, wrong tax certificates are getting pulled. So definitely take the extra time to slow down and make sure that this information is being entered correctly in the first place. So just generally, last thing about order entry here, I'm just going to talk about the most common mistakes in order entry. Number 1 is the type of service. We talked about that. Make sure that your correct type of policy is being issued here. And if you have a question about that, let me know. I can always go over that again. But generally, procedural rule number 38 will tell you exactly how to distinguish between whether you should be issuing a residential or a non-residential policy. Number 2, we just talked about. In the property tab, making sure that you have a county selected in that dropdown. Again, if you don't select a county, it will prohibit you from doing certain things in closing market, which is important. And the last one we talked about is 1099 info on this thing. Now, 1099 info isn't necessarily part of entering an order into the system, but it does need to go in order entry, which is why we put it in the screen. So again, if you have enough information to complete the 1099 portion of order entry, just go ahead and do it right then and there. And that's just as simple as having a full address for the seller and a full social security number for each seller. I know we have some questions in the chat. I'm going to move on because I got 2 more slides, but I will get your questions at the very end. Last thing I'm going to talk about today is what is an escrow officer? Now, this is something that I wanted to point out to everybody, and Stephanie wanted me to point out to everybody, because I think it's confusing for some people as to what exactly is expected of you as escrow officers. Many of you think it's just as simple as I just have to close the transaction. Well, according to TDI, that's not necessarily true. TDI actually is our regulatory body and has created a procedural rule that defines exactly what they consider an escrow officer to be. And it's procedural rule number 1. I'm not going to read this to you, but generally, they do try and annotate the actual duties of an escrow officer, which is really the important piece of information on the slide. Number 1, they countersign title insurance forms. So that includes title commitments, both on the jacket and on Schedule C. That includes policies. Title, we can countersign policies. Any type of form that requires an escrow officer signature on it, that's something that's the responsibility of the escrow officer. Number 2 is supervising preparation and the delivery of title insurance forms. So making sure that you get the commitment out to your parties with an adequate amount of time for them to review it. That's an escrow officer responsibility. Technically, according to TDI, getting your policy out within 90 days is an escrow officer responsibility. Now, we work for a wonderful company that has a policy department to where we don't have to run our own policies. At other title companies, you do have to run your own policies. So we're definitely thankful for that. But just know that it's technically, according to TDI, part of the definition of a responsibility of an escrow officer. Number 3 is signing escrow checks. That's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. I do like to use this opportunity to point out that if you have checks in your branch, you need to make sure that at least one escrow officer signature is on every single check that leaves your office. Now, that doesn't have to be a full-time escrow officer. If you're an assistant and you're licensed, that qualifies as an escrow officer requirement. But every title insurance check needs to have an escrow officer signature on it. Somebody licensed as an escrow officer needs to sign it. And the last one, and probably the most confusing, is closing the transaction. That's something that TDI says is, again, part of the escrow officer responsibility pool. But many people ask, okay, well, what exactly is closing the transaction? Because that's kind of a broad statement. Well, lucky for us, TDI also actually defines that in the same procedural rule. Who would have thought? In a different subsection, so to speak. But they define closing the transaction as the investigation made by a title company that determines multiple pieces of information. Number 1, did you properly execute all conveyances? So in English, this means, was all interest vested properly to the buyer? Did you cure everything on Schedule C that allowed you to convey clear title to the buyer? Number 2 is all delinquent taxes are paid and taxes are properly prorated. So remember at the beginning of this webinar, we talked about how important it was to have a tax certificate update done in an appropriate amount of time. This is why, because TDI specifically states that the escrow officer closing the transaction responsibility is to ensure that delinquent taxes are paid and properly prorated. So as escrow officers, we want to make sure that we have the most recent information to make sure that we're prorating properly. Now, in a time of year like now, when we're not in payable season, you're not necessarily going to have to worry as much about delinquent taxes, although they certainly do happen even in non-payable season. I would think that updating your tax certificate now is more important for proration purposes. I have seen many times where they will pull a tax certificate when they open the order and pull a second tax certificate, and they've removed the over 65 exemption, and now the tax amount went up, which means your prorations are all wrong. So it's important that we get those tax certificates updated, particularly because TDI is specifically enumerated this as a responsibility of the escrow officer closing the transaction. Next one, consideration is passed and proceeds dispersed. Again, pretty simple. We want to make sure that people that needed to be paid are paid. That's including that lenders get paid off and execute a release. Sellers get paid the amount of proceeds that are appropriate. Any invoice on the property that relates to the sale of the transaction is paid. This is pretty common sense, but I do like to point out that that is an expectation of us as escrow officers. And the last one, and probably more important, is the final search of the title has been made. I said last, it's second to last. Again, we talked about why bring to dates are important. This just further annotates why exactly bring to dates are important. TDI went out of their way to specifically state that you need to do a final search of the title. And you accomplish that through completing a bring to date before closing. Remember, bring to dates are there to protect you as escrow staff from things that might have happened between the time you opened the order and pulled the title commitment and right now at closing. It's a really simple process and will save you a lot of heartache, so just don't forget to run those bring to dates. The last one is a pretty common sense one. All necessary papers are filed of record. That's just making sure that any recordables need to be, filed. Did you file a release of lien for the lender they paid off? Even if that happened 6 months after closing, that's still your responsibility according to P1F. Did you get the warranty deed and deed of trust recorded in an appropriate amount of time? According to TDI, that has to be within 48 hours of funding. Now, if you close late on a Friday and don't get recorded till Monday, not a big deal. We're talking about business hours here. So just make sure that you're recording these things, again, within the 48-hour window. And guys, that's pretty much it as far as the information I wanted to give you. I want to go ahead and review a couple things, and I'll answer some questions in the chat. Number one, we talked about attendance and the reward system. So again, moving forward, after every session, starting in March, there's going to be a short quiz that you're going to be required to complete in order to earn a credit for that class. And once you've earned 5 credits, Capital Title will graciously give you an extra half day of PTO to use however you like. But again, please be sure that you're getting branch manager approval before you take this extra half day of PTO. Next, respond to your audits. If you're getting an email, whether that be an actual audit or an email from corporate or settlement services after closing requesting information, it's not because they're lazy and not looking for the information. It's because they were unable to readily identify that information in file scan within 5 minutes. Again, they are using the same logic as a TDI auditor would. If a TDI auditor goes in that file and they can't find what they're looking for in the first couple minutes, they're just going to assume it's not there. And accordingly, all that staff that does the audit and review on the back end is going to use the same method. Again, take extra time to complete order entry. Make sure the information is as detailed as possible. It will ensure accuracy and it will help avoid errors both on the pre and post-closing side. And we didn't really talk about this, but I do like to point this out. I highly recommend that everybody uses Shattuck Doc Prep for their doc prep needs. We have people that work with Shattuck Doc Prep that also happen to work in RamQuest support. So these guys are really good at going in your file and getting the information they need to get in order to prepare your documents. In my experiences, most times they're able to get you your document request in less than a half an hour. And truthfully, they're looking out for you more than a normal doc prep attorney would, who's really just concerned with copy pasting grantor and grantee information and charging you $100 to do it. Shattuck Doc Prep also helps pay for some of the things that we've gotten accustomed to here at Capital Title. First and foremost, our Christmas party is mostly paid for by Shattuck Doc Prep. So that being said, that's basically the premise of what I wanted to cover today. I'm going to go into the chat, and I know we're running a little bit over an hour, and I apologize about that, but I'm just going to answer some questions here, and then we will go ahead and wrap it up. So first question here. Okay, so this is a continuation off a recording question. The amount on the recording fees pulled through to the CD, but the lender asks what the extra recording fees are for. Is there a good way to disclose that on the T64 properly and in the recording section? So if your lender is asking what they're for, most of the time a simple explanation is enough to suffice. But if they're still going to buck on it, or they're going to have an underwriting requirement that you have to prove somehow that it's a legitimate charge, you can pull a copy of your T64, and provided you've entered your recording fees correctly into the recording itemization screen, it will automatically populate that recording fee for the municipal utility district notice. And that should be enough to placate your lender's needs. Now, if you're running into an instance where that does not, and your lender's giving you a super hard time, I highly encourage you to reach out to me. I am more than happy to step in and help, satisfy whatever requirement the lender might have with you guys. Next question. In the services tab, the residential versus non-residential applies to the buyer only, correct? So if the seller is a trust and the buyer is a natural person, we would choose residential. That's correct. We don't care about what the seller is. We care about what the buyer is, because we're not insuring the seller under the owner's policy. We're insuring the buyer. So that's why it's important. Again, I'm going to say it again because it's the easiest thing to memorize. Two-prong test. Is it a natural person, and is it residential real property? If the answer is yes to both of those questions, it's residential. If it is not yes to both of those questions, it's non-residential. And again, procedural rule 38 is what will actually state that. Next question. After the lender is entered, is there an automatic way to add standard verbiage requested by lenders? So we're talking about even successors and or signs. Generally, you're limited to, what Bulletin 157 says that you can say, right? So we can't put ISAOA language on CPLs, but generally, if I'm going to have to add the exact successor and or signs language under Section 12C of the stipulations, blah, 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 generally what I do is when I pull a copy of the title commitment, I will just scroll down to Schedule A, which is down here, and just type it in myself under the proposed insured. That's generally the best way to do it. All right, next question. Info will pull from order entry to page 5 now. That is correct based on you selecting the correct agent. So if you select an agent for the realtor in order entry and that particular agent whoever completed it, whoever created it, didn't put license information in there, obviously that information won't pull over. So really, when it's pulling over to page 5, this is more for agents that we're creating. Take the extra time to make sure that their license numbers are in the agent card. Otherwise, you're just going to have to right-click and override like you guys were doing before. Now, generally, individually, myself and Stephanie, we're trying to figure out a workaround for that. I think a lot of the reason that a lot of the agents in our system are missing information is just because, truthfully, a lot of people are just being lazy. Instead of searching for an agent, they're just creating a new one and using it on the CD. And this has caused a very a large amount of agents to be duplicated. And so we're working on that. We don't have a solution for it quite yet, but in the next couple of months, you'll probably hear some stuff both in the escrow officer meetings and just through the grapevine about how we're going to try and fix that. Okay, guys, I think that's all the questions. So I'm going to give it about 30 seconds. If anybody else has any other questions, feel free to ask them in the chat. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, whether that be pertinent to what we've reviewed or if it's just a random question. I'm here for you guys. But if you have no more questions, I really, truly appreciate you guys attending today. I hope that you found this information beneficial. If you are watching this webinar on somebody else's computer and you're not logged in the attendees right now, if you could send me an email and let me know that you watched it with somebody else, I'd appreciate that. That way I make sure that you guys get credit for the webinar. And everybody have a good rest of your Wednesday. We're almost done. Less than 2 hours left. Got another question here. When you have a note for the examiner, such as a certain party is deceased, do you add the note in the light bulb or the note screen in the order entry screen? So the old way that we used to have to do that sort of thing is to enter it into the note screen in order entry. Truthfully, you really should be putting that information in the light bulb from now on. And here's the reason why. When another department gets assigned this task from the light bulb, when they get that task in their dashboard, they're going to see the actual notes for the file itself in this screen. So I know that almost none of us are using the actual dashboard to RamQuest, but that's the reason why we switched to the light bulb. Because the dashboard, and I'll pull it up here, it allows certain departments to have all of the files that are assigned to them pulled into one spot. And you can see in one of these screens here is the notes. So if you have some information that you want to tell to the abstractors or the examiners, put it here. It used to be that we used to put it in the main tab of order entry, but it really makes more sense to put it here in the light bulb now. And if you're having an examiner or abstractor that are giving you a hard time about putting it in the light bulb screen, let me know. I can get with Russ Connor and Craig Brooks, and we can get to the bottom of exactly why people are giving us a hard time about that.